Right, hello there. Looks like everything is sorted out and the Ubes are tubing. So today we are finally going to add some poses to, custom poses to the room. So it's only taken us 6 other videos and 6 times 1.5 hours. So relatively long time, but lots of discussions about all the sorts of stuff that you can do with your rooms and what you should look out for. So I think this was mentioned in one of the previous streams. These aren't button pushing, do this, do that types of streams. It's all about you having the information to get the best from whatever it is that you're making with minimal effort. So let's close these browsers, otherwise the computer will overheat. Yoink. Right, so yesterday, this is more or less where we left off. So we added, as was discussed yesterday, a number of interest features. So the room that we had before we started doing all of this, number 11. Oh, let's just open up another instance of Blender for this. So that's what we had, that's what we were working with. So that sets up the basic room in terms of what it is, how big it is, and the basic elements that we have in the room, as well as pretty much the basic seating pattern or the positions of the avatars. So what we can do, or what we did, is updated that so that we ended up with this. So essentially all we've done is we haven't touched the main room in terms of the basic structure of the room. We've still got a lot of space available in the main floor area for people to drop furniture items into. Obviously that's notwithstanding the furniture nodes that are all over the walls and the floor and all over the place. But so what we've done is utilize the space around the floor, which ordinarily would be unused, for want of a better word, unused, and we've added some features of interest. So we've added wall panels, a bunch of wall panels, door handles. We've done some customization to the boxes. We've now got a expensive ladder, decorator's ladder, and some insulation that we can use potentially for poses. Oh, now we've also got some light fittings. So to make those, let's just do a quickie on those. Very simple. Where's the cursor gone? There's the cursor. Let's just add that, move that to the center of the room. Make it easier to see. 0, 0, 0. Right, so that's the cursor there. So let's add a cylinder, mesh, cylinder, and in the pop-up, what we can do, this is a little trick. So the light is actually a 5-sided object. Normally, if you do a 6 or an 8 or a 12, however many sides. You want to keep them to a minimum if they are not prominent features. So the ceiling lights, because they are up on the ceiling, they're not prominent features, so they're not necessarily going to be seen all the time. So you don't necessarily need to waste too many polygons on things like this. Whoops, and now we've lost the ability to edit our mesh, so I'll have to get rid of that, delete that, do it again. So you don't have to waste too many polygons on things like this. So if you want to make your object relatively detailed, make the detail count in terms of structure. So we've added an indentation. What would that be? I'm not quite sure what the word is for that. We've inset the light bulb from the end cap. So we've actually used some extra, essentially, extra structure for this little, whoops, this little inset. Rather than making the lamp itself or the light 8, 12, 16 sided, we've just made it 5, and there's a reason for the 5 which we'll get into in a minute. We've made it 5 sided and just added a bit more detail, because the reduction of that from just 6 sided gives us a bit more room to play around with when we start adding structure. But one of the things that you want to look out for when you are adding things to your rooms like that is cylinder. What you can do, instead of doing 6-sided, so the thing with a 6-sided object in this particular context where we're making a light, it's very obviously a 6-sided object. So you can't necessarily rotate that to any degree where you're not going to notice that it has 6 sides. Whoops, and now we'll have to redo that. Get rid of that again. That's the unfortunate thing with this, with Blender, that once you place an object, once you manipulate it, you lose the ability to change its fundamental characteristics. So that has to be done before you do anything. But anyway, as we were saying, 6-sided is obviously 6-sided. But what you can do is reduce it down one to a 5-sided object, or another one is 7-sided as opposed to 8-sided. Because when you make the objects, is that even or odd? Even. Even-sided, so 8, 10, 12, 16, upwards. It can be obvious that they are even-sided. As opposed to 7, just that reduction means that the shape is still implied that it's round, but you're using less surfaces or less structure to make the shape. But we use 5, so reduce that to 5. Whoops. Another one is to use 4, enable smoothing. I won't do it now because we'll lose the ability to change it. But if you use smoothing, because the way that smoothing works, it makes the surface look round or organic. And what you can do with really low poly stuff is rotate it 45 degrees, and you'll be looking at the edge, which makes the object look round as opposed to a square, like a handrail, for example. If you had a handrail and you made it square, you could rotate it 45 degrees and the handrail would look round with smoothing enabled. But, so, whoops, this is how you can make your, so we're going to rotate that 90. Just move that up so we can see it. So this is going to be ginormous, just for the sake of ease of seeing what we're doing. edit mode. So this is our ginormous lamp or light. Loop cut, and we're just guesstimating the ends. Face select, select that section in the middle, and we can extrude this inwards. Not using, well, you can either use a tool, which is a bit awkward, or oh, we can't do it with that. It's extrude along normals. There we go, that's the one. So we get this thing that looks like a fuse. I just offset that a little bit, and we get a lamp or lighting fixture. And then to UV unwrap this, edit mode, unwrap the top edge because it's going to be hidden from view mostly. Mark seams. We can switch to UV editor, focusing on our object. Select all, and then unwrap. So let's get the light texture that was made earlier. Unwrap again. And then all excuse me. And then all we need to do, whoops, is edit the UVs so that they fit the texture that we've got. It's not appearing on the mesh at the moment because it doesn't have a material. So if we add a material to this object, lights, it appears on the object. So that's just a very simple way of creating a light, or a what do they call those? Fluorescent light. And that's all those ones at the top are. So let's just hide that, and we will take a closer look. So what have we got? We've got feature elements that we can use to create some poses. So we've got some empty boxes, as we were saying. We've got wall panels, and yesterday we mentioned that what this means is that we can have maybe a pose looking into an open box or looking round the back of these panels, climbing the ladder to maybe push this in place. We've got these piles of boxes that we might be able to use as well. You've got this installation in the corner. So with the box here, we might be able to do a pose where this is being moved out of the way, or the avatar is leaning over the box to get to this installation panel, which is supposed to fit here, or would fit there. So there are a number, oh, and there's door handles as well. And one of them now has a little key. So a little brass key. So little things like that that add feature interest. Oh, and the door on the sign on the door. Things like that can be used to create your poses. Otherwise, you have a relatively boring, it's not the right word, but a relatively standard room that doesn't have much interest on its face. So let's just save this. Save as 17. So for poses, what we have to do is set up the avatar spots to accommodate the poses that we want to create. So we've got 6 by default. The room needs 6, otherwise IMVU will place spots into the room, and it'll place them based on the location of room skeleton, which is at the center here. So if you don't have 6 seat nodes or pose spots in the room by default, they will be added in a line relative to the skeleton node, which is the master node of the room. So it's worth taking a few minutes, even if you're just placing the defaults, so that's the standing nodes and the sitting nodes, and just placing those around so that you have at least a basic point of interest from the point of view of using the room. The camera is pointing at the first seat in the room. You'll generally want to set them up so that that is happening. So when the room loads in IMVU, we are essentially looking through the camera at the avatar that sat down on the box straight in front of us. So for our custom seat nodes or custom pose spots, what we're going to do is add some more seat node sets. So we have to select, it doesn't matter whether it's the standing or sitting node sets, we just have to select a set of nodes and duplicate them. Press escape to reset or right click depending on how you've got your mouse set up, and just move that node into place relative to where the avatar is expected to appear. So we move them all as a group, but once we've excuse me, once we've roughly positioned the avatar, what we can do is just shift the capture and picture nodes out of the way. Oops. So we've got clear access to the seat node itself, because this, the bottom one at least, the seat node, that'll be our reference point for the pose. So we need to do this a couple of times using the pose spots that we've got positioned around the room. So we're selecting that set of nodes, duplicating that, right click reset, rotate that. So we're rotating the group and putting that in front of the ladder. Again, we can move the catcher and pitcher, keep the distance the same, but we can move them to one side, that's all right. And you want to try and keep the orientation relative to the catcher being close to the avatar, because that's where the avatar that's associated with the seat, so that's our seat node, this set is associated with this node. So if you rotate or position the nodes and catcher is where the picture is, the avatar in IMVU then has to move there, and wherever the other avatar is, it moves. This looks like a football, the American football play. So keep that in mind, and depending on where you put your poses, you might have to adjust the nodes for the other ones, just to give room. Do the same with that one. Duplicate objects. We'll put that in front of the box. And again, grab those two, swing those around. Like so. So that is, so we've got 1, 2, 3 custom spots. So let's do another one, and this time we can use the seating node. Even though we're not actually going to create a seated position, we can use the nodes. Duplicate. We might not get all of these done, but we can at least have them in place. And again, move catcher and pitcher. Right, so those are 4. Let's just hide the sidebar for now. So we have 4 extra custom spots. So before we do anything, we want to do something to the skeleton now that we've got all those extra parts. So in the outliner, what we want to do is make sure that our nodes are numerically incremental. So we've added 4 sets, so we need to rename the new nodes per set incrementally. So we've got a set, so catcher 1, so let's just select all of these. So those are the nodes that are associated with that pose spot. They're all numbered 1 because that's the primary seat. And it's a set, so we have to do the same thing for all the others. but we had 6 before. So this new set, so that's number 3001, so that's going to be 7. That's handle 7, so double click. Double click. And double click. So let's just check that. Select. So that's this set of nodes. So we just need to double check that they're all 7. So 7 sitting, 7, 7, and 7. Right, so the next one is 8. We need to do this, otherwise the seat nodes won't work. 8, 8, 8, and 8. So this might be, so this is number 9. So this might be easier earlier on in the project, where we hadn't joined or parented everything together in order to export the room for IMVU, because the sets are still complete. They're still linked to one another as a set, as opposed to trying to track down. So that's number 9. Because of course in a very big room, doing this can be quite tricky. And the last one is 10. Right, so we have, so these are just the dummies. So we have seat nodes, or seats, 1 to 10, picture 1 to 10, handle 1 to 10, and catcher 1 to 10. And we need to do that to make sure that the room works. Right, so let's just save that. So lots of incremental saves, so we've always got a restore point to go back to. Save as. Right, so what we have to do now is export the room mesh. So we have to join everything together. So let's hide the seating, we don't need that for the moment. There's nothing in blocks. So if you want to reorganize this, so we want to move these light objects, that's these two things that we created earlier. We want to move those into a collection, into the room collection, so all the meshes are in the same place. So click, drag, and you can scroll up and down whilst the mouse is still clicked and held, just move the mouse over the room collection, the heading, and just drop them in, and there are our new objects into the group. So these collections replace layers. So in the way that in the old version where we would have the layers, where would it be? Well, it would be down here somewhere, those little buttons where you could move things around and store them in the layers. Collections now replace those. So we don't need blocks because there's nothing in there. Right, so just going to save over that. What we need to do is join everything together. And we want to leave we're going to save this. We want to leave everything basically as is. So we want to join all the room mesh stuff together just because it makes it easier to do the next bit. Just going to do an incremental save because we don't necessarily want everything joined together right now from the project's point of view. Save as. Right, so what we're going to do now is reset Blender. So that's the default. We're going to open the pose file. I'm going to use the alternative pose file for this because it's easier to pose the... Oh, it's easier to see what's going on. There it is, alternative pose file. And depending on the version of Blender that you're using, you may need to click this cog button and disable load UI. What that'll do is it'll force Blender to completely ignore all the interface settings that are stored in the project file, because some of the older versions of Blender brought into some of the settings stored in the older versions, older file versions, cause problems for Blender 2. Well, this is 8.2. So if we disable that, it'll ignore all the interface settings, all the buttons and stuff. And then what we have to do is just reset the view. So we want scale, change that in viewport overlays. So that's that button. Want that changed to, whoops, 100, because IMVU is 100 times larger than Blender. And then in view sidebar, the view menu or the view properties, we want to change, because we're importing a room, we probably want to go to 10,000 for that. That's clip start. That changes the distance from the camera to, well, it's a clip distance, so anything past 10,000 will be clipped from view. Clip start 1. And then what we can do is file, append, we need to go to our room mesh, click on it, well, double click, and it acts as an archive, like a zip file. So inside the Blender file, so the Blender file is, imagine that as, instead of .blend, it's a .zip. Double click that and we can see the contents of the file. So we want to click on Object in this particular instance, and we've got all the stuff that's in the project. And what we want is garage. Where is it? Garage.mesh. So we want the mesh, and then we want the seat nodes. So we want the 4 that we added. So that's hold control down 10, 9, 8 and 7. And we also want skeleton.room just so that we have a sense of where the room center is. So click that. So garage mesh, seat nodes, those are okay, and then just append, click the append button. And what that does is it brings all of those elements into the pose file. So because it's appending, it brings in all the material information and the textures, everything is brought in. So the way that we work with this is that what we have to do, let's just hide that for the moment. Let's just hide those. What's that one? Oh, skeleton.room. So what we've got is a skeleton setup that represents the avatar. The avatar has its own root node, which is this black bone at the bottom. It's black just to basically, you don't want to mess around with that bone. Don't touch that bone when you are animating. That stays static, generally speaking, whenever you're doing something. But this bone has a little dot in it. That little dot. And that's the origin point for the entire skeleton. It's also the origin point for where the avatar appears in IMVU. So what we have to do with the parts that we've just imported, what we have to do when we're creating poses is match up the seat node, that's the custom seat node. We have to match that so that has its own little dot as well, origin point. That origin point has to match up with the origin point of the avatar, and it has to orientate relative to, so in the project file the avatar is standing facing that way, the avatar is facing this way. So what we have to do is rotate not just the seat node, but we have to maintain the relative position of the seat node to the room. So we have to rotate the seat nodes, well, all of them. We have to keep everything in alignment. We have to rotate everything so that this forward facing position matches the pose forward facing position. So we're basically rotating the entire room around so that, I don't think it'll do it this, no. So what we have to do that is select the seat nodes, because we want to move the room as a unit and the skeleton, and so this is our reference point. So to make this easy to see what we're doing, what we can do is enable the widget so we can see its orientation, and it is it global or local. So what we want to do is rotate the entire project based on this node so that it points relative to the pose. Whoops. So this is where it gets a little tricky if you're using local. Switch to global, just double check that it hasn't, and then what we want to do is move that into position. So this is where our orthographic or orthogonal views come in handy. Switch to skeleton mode. And we don't necessarily need to be exact, but you do want to try and be relatively precise. So we're trying to line or align the origin point to where the axis crosses, which is where the avatar is centered on the grid. So once we've done that, the avatar is positioned relative to the room. So now we can create a pose. Select the skeleton. What we want to do is switch to, so we're clicking the editor selection button. Click that. We want dope sheet. If this is not set, it should be set. I'm not quite sure why it's not set. And then action editor. So that changes to this. We can see the bone that we've got currently selected. We can see all the bones if we disable this button or turn that off, and we'll see all the bones, all color coded. So what have we got? We've got our T-pose. Where's that gone? Oh, there it is. So this is the default T-pose. What we can do is duplicate that and create a new sequence that we can then create our pose for static pose. So to do that, click this icon. It'll duplicate the sequence that we had active. It'll make it unique by appending, whoops, that 001. Just rename this, and we'll call this seat8.pose. So now all we have to do is pose this. So let's do right, so let's move, oh, double check, actually go back to the timeline. Auto insert is enabled. That just means that whenever we pose a bone, it'll automatically insert the position, rotation, location information. Select our widget, and then what we can do is move the character. So we're selecting the bone, and this is what was meant by, if you need to move the avatar away from its seat node, move the pelvis bone, not that's female 03 master root. So use the pelvis bone. So what we can do is create a so we're selecting a bone and just manipulating the avatar. So that's the shoulder, elbow. We're going to have it looking behind, so hands against the wall. So you can move the bones using the loops, the colored loops, and that will move the bone in that specific orientation relative to the bone. We're in global at the moment, which means the bone is being manipulated relative to the axis of the scene. So if you look at the green and red axis markers, the widget follows them, it matches them, so they're both pointing in the same sort of direction. So to make bone posing easier, what you can do is switch to local, and that changes the orientation of the widget to match the bone. And what that means is it makes it easier to manipulate the bone. But what you can do is manipulate the axis, or you can manipulate using, well, clicking anywhere inside this white outline, which will move the bone on multiple axes. And it's sometimes easier to do that because it moves on multiple axes. And the advantage of doing that, as opposed to manipulating the axes, is that it tends to produce a much more natural rotation. Whoops. A much more natural rotation of the bone. So looking behind the sheets for a mouse, what we can do is we can hide the skeleton so that we can see the approximate position the avatar will occupy. So that's what that pose will actually look like in IMVU. Whoops, that's the wrong bone. correct that wrist. So that is our first static pose. Which is aligned to that seat node, so that's seat 8. So that's one of the standing nodes. What I'll do is I'll do one for the sitting node so we can see that we don't need to use only standing seat pose spots or sitting pose spots to define or determine what the pose is that's associated with those spots. All these are anchor points. That's all they are. They're just anchor points for the avatar, so you can make your pose whatever you want. Just to double check, select all, and we're going to pose, animation, insert keyframes, and location, rotation, and that does it. It's already set to automatically insert them, but it's a good idea just to double check. And because this is a static pose, what we need to do is duplicate that. So make sure everything is selected. All, pose, copy. Move the timeline slider to another keyframe, say 5. Pose, paste. So we now have a frame range. And then move it to 10, and we need to do a reset. So we need to clear the pose. So pose, clear transform, and then what we want is all. If you're using FBX when you're exporting your content, you need to do this. So that resets the avatar. And this is needed so that the content, the pose, will export. Otherwise the file will think there's nothing in there, there's no data. Right, so that's the first pose. Select the T-pose. Oh, hang on, before we do that, we need to enable this button, which is called Fake User. Activate that so the pose remains in the file. We can save the file, save as. Garage plus poses. Oh, which one are we on? 19. Well, 18. Save as. Right, so make sure the skeleton's in pose mode, or we can be in object mode, doesn't matter. Select T-pose because we want to reset, because what we have to do now is select our seat nodes, room, skeleton, all the seat nodes, highlight the node that we want, and we have to remember which way round that avatar is facing. So let's load in, don't save, 18. Okay, so the avatar is facing the box. So we need to rotate the entire room. View, top. Based on this node, Oh, we're in local orientation again, so global. So you'll have to keep switching between those two, global and local. Whenever you're moving something into position, in terms of what's in this file, use global. When you're positioning bones, use local. And again, we need to position that origin at that point. Make sure the rotation is good. So that's that. Select skeleton and create another. So we can either click on this numerical 2 button, or we can do what we did before and click on the file icon. That duplicates the T-pose again. And we name this one seat 07.pose. And we'll create our pose. So pose mode. And for this one, let's move a bit closer. And we'll just have maybe the avatar leaning forward. Whoops, seeing what's in the box. So we want to switch to local. So there is one thing that you do want to watch out for. And if you're a clothing maker, we've gone over this with some of the clothing streams. When you are rotating the arm to position it, generally speaking, you want to be using the shoulder bone, which is this tiny little square, because that acts as the rotational point, the ball and socket. But if you're a clothing maker, you'll notice that the way that they pose the legs, they use the thigh bone, they don't use the hip bone. And in some poses, you'll get the same sort of problem occurring where the mesh starts to deform in a really nasty way, because the mesh deformation isn't spread. So this section of the mesh isn't spread across these two bones. In fact, you could actually spread it across the pelvis and lower spine. So there's 4 bones that this entire area could be spread across. The shoulder is the same. And what sometimes is not quite the right word. It's quite frequently what people will do is they'll pose by using the bicep bone. And if you do that, it'll collapse the shoulder or make the shoulder look really odd, because the bicep bone should rotate only. It shouldn't act as the ball and socket for the shoulder. Whoops. Dagnabbit. So that's what you want to watch out for when you're posing. So if you can, spread the pose across multiple bones. So even though the character's arm is reaching out, and you could in theory do that with rotating or positioning just the bicep bone, what you want to try and do as best as possible is use all three bones as a major structure that is being modified to, as you would do in real life. When you hold your arm forward, you're moving your collarbone, your shoulder bone, and well, it's not the bicep, we don't have a bicep bone, but because these two are attached, but you are moving that mesh section, this entire section. The movement is spread across the three bones, so you end up with a much nicer deformation of the mesh. So that's just a tip, a tip to watch out for. So we'll create a pose where the character is just opening or holding open the box. So let's hide the skeleton, take a look at that. We don't necessarily need to mess around too much with the fingers, because their natural position tends to accommodate pretty much most sorts of poses. That's a bit twisty, so let's reset that. But if you want to move the thumb bones, just select them like all the others. Move it into place. Oops. Let's reset the leg. So that's Alt-R, all, pose, clear transform, all, and it'll clear for whatever is selected. So what we could do with this is whoops. It's a bit too much. It's a bit too high. Undo. So let's have the avatar kneeing the box to keep it from falling over. So that's a bit awkward, that pose. So let's clear that. Let's see what that looks like. That's better. So we've got a second pose that uses the seating spot, even though this is a standing pose. So that's pose number 2. We'll probably have to do the other poses offline because it'll take a while to do. But that just goes through the process of highlighting, creating poses for rooms. So you're basically importing or appending the room mesh into the pose file, orientating the nodes per pose relative to the default pose, well, the alternative avatar pose, and then posing. So you create your sequence, pose all the bones. So that's seat 7, so double check that's pose, select all, pose, animation, insert keyframe, location, rotation, we don't use scale, so lock rot. We need to do the same thing again, so copy, pose, copy, move the timeline slider to frame 5, paste, so we've now got a duplicate, and then at frame 10 we clear transform all, and that resets the pose. So this is incidentally the principle for creating an animated pose, but this is a static pose. So that's 2 poses created. One using the sitting spot, one using the sitting node and one using the standing node. And of course, once you've got your pose, you can't obviously, well, you can swap poses. Oh, we need to. You can swap poses, but the pose is relative to the avatar in the avatar file, not the room. So you'd have to rejig the scene. So you'd select your elements, realign them. Let's just do this quickly. You have to realign them. In order to do any further work on those pose spots or those poses. So that is one thing that you have to watch out for. And of course, it does mean that because we have auto insert enabled, it means that it animates all the objects in the scene, but you can ignore all of that. So that's the basic principles of creating poses, and then of course you export all of this. Well, you export the skeleton, and the skeleton includes the pose files. So what I'll do offline is I'll create a set of another couple of poses. So we've got 2 more spots, one for the ladder and one for the insulation. So I'll create 2 more poses offline, and then in the next stream what we'll do is we'll export the whole lot to IMVU as an FBX file. So we'll export an FBX that'll include the animations that we've created. Let's select the right pose. So it'll export the poses, and then we'll export the room because it's basically done, and then we'll assemble everything in IMVU and see what the furniture room looks like. So that is poses, or the basics of poses, and obviously it can be a little fiddly, can be a little time consuming, but it's worth doing. Take your time and remember to toggle between local and global depending on what it is that you're doing. So if you're moving objects to position them for posing, use global, and if you're posing the bones, use local, and that'll change the orientation of the widget to match the avatar skeleton. Right, so oh dear. So we'll call it quits there, and on the next one, like I say, we'll do some exporting and assemble all of this with all the poses. Right, so thanks for lurking, lurkers, and we shall see you. Oh, and do the usual subscribing, following, all that stuff, all the good stuff, and we'll see you on the next stream where we hopefully will export all of this. So bye for now, everyone.